For several years now, Energy Media has argued that Canada needs a national energy strategy. Why? Because the global economy is electrifying. To maintain their lifestyle, Canadians must ensure that their economy is adopting new electric technologies like EVs and heat pumps, and that our power grids produce enough clean, reliable, low cost electricity. Pollution Probe and Quest Canada just released a report that outlines what a national strategy for a low carbon economy could look like. I spoke to Richard Carlson of Pollution Probe about what Canada is doing right, but more importantly, where it needs to improve. Welcome to the interview, Richard.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, you've written this report as a sort of a guideline or some provide recommendations for policymakers in Canada. Maybe we should start with an overview, please.
Well, just to give you a bit of background, this report is a culmination of 3 years of work where we've engaged policymakers, regulators, utilities, and innovators all across Canada from every jurisdiction, trying to listen to them to find out what do they need so they can really start working on low carbon energy innovation and deploying it. That's really our task is how do we deploy new low carbon energy innovation in Canada? So as you're saying, there are actually six recommendations we had at the end, which we saw from all our research. The first one was really we need to align climate policy and market signals. We think that you need both. Markets are great; they do very well, but we need policy. We need policy to be able to direct people as to where they want to go. Second, we need to modernize energy regulation. There's some progress being made across Canada, but for the most part, most Canadian jurisdictions still are not using a modern regulatory framework. And we really need to start pushing through with that. And that includes performance-based regulation, incentive rate regulation, as well as other ideas such as regulatory sandboxes and the like as well. The third is we need to plan energy systems holistically. We still tend to think in silos. Everyone's been talking about moving out of silos for many, many years now, but nothing has happened. We're starting to see some progress here and there across the country, but we really need to push on that as well. Thermal energy is, of course, something that we also want to emphasize because a lot of the innovation we see tends to be on the electricity side, which, of course, with the movement to electrification, that does include thermal as well. But there are other things in thermal energy we need to look at, including how do we back up electrification of heating as well as district heating and other availabilities is there around thermal energy needs. We also need to put Indigenous inclusion in the center. And again, what I'm hopeful that we're seeing progress on that as well, but it's something we still need to work on. Innovation must be inclusive, and everyone in Canada needs to be able to benefit from innovation, particularly Indigenous communities. And the last one, which may actually be the most important, is whenever we talk to innovators and businesses across the country, the first thing they complain about is policy uncertainty. The next thing they complain about is they need the workers. And we really need to work on developing the workforce, not just for today, which we need to do, but also for tomorrow to make sure that we can actually accomplish our goals and move forward.
One of the points that your report makes is that Canada needs a coordinated strategy. And we've been arguing this for a couple of years at Energy Media. There is no strategic direction, really. And we have kind of a decentralized federation, and the federal government isn't all that hard. The provinces have control over energy. How do we go about creating a strategy?
It's going to be very difficult. I think it's going to start at the jurisdictional level. It kind of has to start there because we do live in the confederation we live in, and we cannot. I've been party to many changes in constitution. It's not going to happen, so we're going to have to deal with what we have. And what we really need is to start making sure that every jurisdiction is really looking forward to where they want to go on a climate file, where they want to see net zero, and really start making plans for that. Then we can start bringing them together and talking about that, how we can work together. There's a lot of benefit we're seeing now, of course, about trading across Canada, but there's a lot that this could be an opportunity as well. Like, why are innovations that are being developed in Quebec or in Alberta or in Ontario, they should be able to be more widespread. It should be easier to bring them across the market as well. And so we really need to start thinking about how we can all work together on this and to be able to benefit from what everybody has learned. As we found in our research, almost every jurisdiction is doing something right. Some are doing more than others, but every jurisdiction is doing something right. And there's a lot we can learn from each other if we actually sit down and talk.
What about innovation ecosystems? And this appeals to me because I'm familiar with the Alberta version, and they put there are different organizations like CRIN, and there are organizations, accelerators and incubators attached to universities, and so on. Um, and they actually do a pretty good job of supporting innovation. What do we see in other, especially the big provinces, BC, Ontario, and Quebec? Are they doing something similar?
They're doing something somewhat similar, but it depends on the certain jurisdiction. What we see in Alberta, for example, is you're seeing a lot of smaller organization like Alberta Innovates, Missions Reduction Alberta, doing a lot of smaller projects. In BC and Quebec, what you tend to see are that some of the larger the crown utilities are taking a bit more of a role. In Quebec, in particular, you're seeing Hydro Quebec being a huge player in innovation, and they're doing some really interesting work. And they're seeing it as a economic driver. They've spun off companies from Hydro-Quebec that they've worked on battery technology and the like. And so we are seeing differences, but the general similarities is how do we work with the private sector? How do we bring people together? Innovation doesn't happen in isolation. I mean, people need to talk about it. They need to exchange. And you need to find someone to say, I have this problem. And some say, oh, here's an idea that we can have. And to be able to talk about it beforehand and trying to I think one of the problems we have seen in Canada is that there's always almost been a siloed approach where the utilities kind of do their one thing, or the energy companies do their one thing, and innovation kind of happens over here, and there's a big barrier in between. So it's how do we break through a lot of those barriers? The policy will be the driver, markets can be a driver, but you also need the enabling conditions. You need the permissive environment, not necessarily a totally permissive environment, but you need a more of a permissive environment regulatory in order to allow a lot of those to go through. And you need kind of the push and the pull in order to allow a lot of this.
You also make the point you need the politics. And one of the things we saw come out of the general election a couple of months ago is well, certainly the Liberal government and of Mark Carney is pushing for freeing up the trade barriers between provinces. And if the innovation ecosystem, arguably could be fit into that vision or into that strategy. And is there any chance that the political will that's been created lately might spill over into innovation?
I hope so. I think there is a lot of discussion going on about how we can work together. We at the launch of this report, we had a symposium where we had close to 80 people from all across Canada, from Alberta, BC, Quebec, Ontario, and among others. And everyone was talking, everyone was very excited about this, and everyone was really thinking about how we can move forward. I think there is a huge opportunity for being able, federally as a federal government, to leverage their funds, particularly for smaller provinces such as the Maritimes as well as the North. You just don't have the capital availability to do a lot of these things. So we can kind of leverage the federal funding, leverage the federal guidance, and just make it easier to be able to transfer a lot of these technologies across Canada.
What about regulatory rigidity? Like you make the point that most provinces, they have Crown Corporation utilities and they're operating under a cost of service model. I have to tell you, 2, 3 years ago, I thought that what the Americans were doing in terms of changing the utility business model was very, very interesting. And then I watched the mess that is in the Alberta electricity system, and I thought, oh, hang on a second, maybe we need to rethink that because BC Hydro, once it got policy direction from the BC government, has been doing some interesting things. Quebec Hydro does some very interesting things, and I'm wondering if maybe that cost of service model can't be adapted to what we need today.
I think it's going to depend on the jurisdiction. The cost of service model may continue to work in BC and Quebec, we have strong political direction, and there's someone you can actually direct to do it. Um, but I think we really need to look into how do we couple policy and the market together. And when you want to bring the market in, that's where you really need to look at the regulatory environment. I've been a proponent of regulatory modernization for a long time. Everyone says it's a really boring topic. Finally, people are finding it interesting. I think it's an exciting area, and there's a lot that can be done. There's a lot of There's a lot of work that's being done in even parts of Canada that we can learn from. Some jurisdictions are more advanced than others. Some are still learning. Some are kind of making tentative steps. But if we can unleash a lot of the the smarts and knowledge of these utilities, push them forward, and give them the ability to do so. I think there will be stuff happening. I think there is interest to do stuff. Of course, when you have utilities, it's always how do you rate base it, how do you pay it? That's always going to be a problem. But if we can create a more of a an open regulatory environment where they're rewarded for actually making performances. And one of those good performances could be in doing one of those performance metrics could be in deploying innovation. It could be reducing emissions. How do we bring that together in order to make people actually do stuff? And I think we can do it. It is going to take a bit of a battle because the regulatory system, for good reason, is very, very slow and is very, very they don't make change quickly. So we have to figure out how can we make it safe for them and what can we learn from each other so that every province doesn't have to do the exact same pilot project so that we can actually understand what's happening and then we can start making changes as we go along and to work on improving the regulatory process because I think every jurisdiction would probably benefit from it.
Let's wrap up the interview this way, Richard. We do interviews with American experts about what's going on in the American power grids. We do interviews of China and Europe. And one of the things that's become very clear to me is that there are some countries like China that are electrifying their economies at an amazing rate. And electrification is going to be a issue of economic competitiveness. If you electrify quickly and you do the right things, you'll be competitive. You'll be able to maintain your life, people's lifestyles. If not, you might be in trouble. And Canada kind of has an advantage because we have good power grids and we've got hydropower and nuclear and so on. But it seems like we're slower out of the gate than a lot of other countries to grasp how important this is, how critical this is to our future economic competitiveness. Would you agree or disagree?
To a certain extent, I would agree with you. I think part of the problem is the nature of Canada and that every jurisdiction does things their own way, and there's very little cohesiveness. We don't have a real sense of where we want to move forward. We also have differences in jurisdiction. So what you're saying is true for BC and Quebec that rely heavily on renewables, Ontario to a large extent as well. But how do we in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they still rely heavily on fossil fuels. And that transition is going to take longer, maybe a bit more, it may be a bit more of a messy transition. So how do we also allow that to happen? So it's not I think it's going to be a messier story than we have. But there is, I think the exciting part is that I agree with you, electrification is coming. There's a but not everything will be electrified, but electricity will become the preeminent energy source that most people use. But there's also how can we do it better? And I think there's a lot of really good stuff happening in Canada. It's happening in small places. It's not widespread. It's not necessarily deployed widely. And we really be able to say, how can we take this great stuff that's happening in Canada, use it in Canada, and make sure that all Canadians can benefit from it.
Fair enough. Well, Richard, thank you very much. I'm going to follow your work more closely so we can get you back on this because this topic is not going away. So thank you very much for this.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I look forward to talking in the future.